I know we have a very multicultural, multilingual audience. I'm going to make a stab at saying a couple of good mornings. Buenos dias. Bonjour. Bon dia. Jiao Shango. And I know that there are a number of Somalian families here, and I did go searching for the interpreter because I wanted to find out how to say good morning, but I couldn't find them. Is there anyone here who can tell me how to say good morning in Somali? No? Well, good morning to those families, too. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm going to try to move right into my presentation. I just want to say a couple of words, though it is really an honor for me to be presenting to this group. I think it's the first time that I've had the opportunity to present to so many families who have children with challenging circumstances and with special needs. As Rich mentioned, my memoir, which tells the story of my experience with my own daughter, is called Melanie, Bird with a Broken Wing. Melanie had cerebral palsy, and I'll be telling you a lot about her in the next half an hour. My presentation this morning, though, is called Growing Wings with Melanie, because my experience was one of having to learn not only to help her develop her wings, but to develop my own, because I didn't have them when I started. This was 30 years ago. I must tell you, to start off, Melanie passed away when she was 6 years old, and after her death, I promised myself to write the story of my experience with her within a year of her death. And I wrote it and completed it by the anniversary of her death, the first year. I put it on my desk, and it sat there for almost 30 years. I finally published it. Thank you. I'm going to invite you this morning to go on a little journey, very short version of my journey with Melanie with me. I know that my journey is no more joyful, no more challenging, no more painful, no more wonderful, no more inspiring than yours. You all have stories that are capable of inspiring us all. I just happen to be in a position to be able to put mine on paper and to put it out for other people to read. I hope it will be helpful to you. As I speak, there are 4 themes I'm going to address. I'll talk about my own experience, and I'll read a bit from the book, but I'm going to try to weave it into 4 themes that are very common in our concerns about families. One is my own reaction as a mother to the shock of having my daughter born with a situation that I had not anticipated. The second is the importance of professionals, and professionals who have positive lenses and how powerful they can be in our lives. The third is the importance of intensive therapy for kids, in her case with physical disabilities, but this would apply to children with many kinds of needs. And finally, but certainly not least, I'm going to talk a bit about the importance of family, which is why we are all here. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. A famous poem that some of you may know by T.S. Eliot called The Hollow Men came to my mind when I started writing my little girl's story, because Melanie came into the world not with a bang, but a whimper, with a whimper. Clive said that his first moments of fear came when he saw the ash-gray color of her skin. My senses were not so sharp. Having no idea of what a newborn baby should look like, I thought her strange but beautiful. They said, "It's a girl," but I felt no surprise, only a quiet fulfillment at receiving confirmation of what I had known all along. The doctor laid her on my stomach, and while he cut the cord that for 9 awesome months had bound her to me, I fondled the tiny, down-covered head. Suddenly I realized that we were all waiting, and someone said something about a cry. After an interminable moment, there was a small sound. There was relief in the room, but I said, "That was a cry?" And they said, "Yes, it's okay." And, I believe, some other reassuring comments. But my moment for fear had come, for I knew that my baby's first sound had been scarcely a whimper. The next shock was her weight. 4.5 pounds seemed very little for a full-term baby, but I was wheeled out of the delivery room, allowing myself to be comforted by the doctor's assurance that the baby's fine. For the next hour or so, Clive and I talked. I have no recollection of what we said. Then he left and I slept. Later that night, on his return, it was Clive who said, "Where is she? I want to see her," and went directly to the nursery. I felt no inclination to see her. Yet I do not recall being aware of harboring any specific fear or sense of her being in danger. I can only surmise that the fear had gone underground. For the next afternoon, almost 24 hours after my baby's birth, I had made no attempt to see her. My friend Anne arrived, her eyes filling with tears, joyful tears at the news that I had got my much longed-for daughter, and it was then that I finally roused myself and went to the nursery. She was more beautiful than I had remembered, with no fat or baby wrinkles to hide or distort the delicately chiseled nose, mouth, and high, wide cheekbones. Her face was exquisite, but around the tiny neck hung layers of thin, loose skin, such as one might expect in an old woman. Her body was perfectly formed, and in proportion to the tiny head, and her skin, by then benefiting from the incubator's oxygen, a rich, dark brown. She lay in her glass cubicle like a fragile china doll, her movements slight and her breathing imperceptible. And as I watched her, fear closed an icy hand around my heart. I held Melanie for the first time when she was 7 or 8 days old. Until then, I had been merely a spectator, watching in awe as she was taken out of the incubator for feeding or changing. My sense of inadequacy was so great that it had not occurred to me to ask to hold her. And on Thursday, I believe it was the nurse who made the suggestion. I held out my arms with a fearful eagerness. As the tiny bundle rested there, I was taken aback at her lightness, and all at once I was overwhelmed by a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach and a rush of weakness in my arms, as though all their strength had suddenly drained away. It was as though I could not support such lightness. There was too little of her, no feeling of substance to command my support, to demand my strength. My muscles would surely turn to jelly, and I would drop her. The moment passed. I emerged aware of a terrible tenseness in my arms, indeed throughout my whole body, and I knew that I had had to summon up every ounce of strength to support 4 pounds of life. And that was my beginning with Melanie. The fear that overwhelmed me at the very beginning slowly but surely went away. I know that you are familiar with that feeling. The fear was a fear of my own inadequacy. It was a fear of, well, I guess it was two things. It was one, fear that I couldn't really cope with what I was faced with, and fear that did I really want to? Did I really want to cope with this? And gradually, as I learned more and more about my beautiful little bird, as I came to call her, I grew from strength to strength in learning to love her. Let me move to my second theme, which is what I call the bearer of bad news. And I should say the bearers of bad news, because there were many. How many of you know them? You know who I'm talking about? Yeah, the bearers of bad news. And some people do it wonderfully well, and some people do it horribly. And I had both experiences as you have. But I'll just read you the little introduction to that chapter that I call the bearer of bad news, and then I'll come to some gooder news. I have said that I gradually came to include our pediatrician among my most unsupportive public. I'd like to clarify this. First of all, I think it must be the rare mother who can succeed in not harboring some resentment toward the bearer of bad news regarding her child. It must also be the rare doctor who can carry out this unhappy task and simultaneously behave in a manner that will continue under much pressure to be supportive. I say under much pressure because most parents will probably appear to be trying to pressure the doctor into clarifying, expanding on, and perhaps even changing his original diagnosis. Indeed, all that I have read on the subject of parents' responses shows that parents are often so stunned by the first statement of the diagnosis that very little of what they are told sinks in at that time. They therefore keep coming back to the doctor with questions that he feels sure he has already answered. It seems only natural that he would eventually find this persistence irritating. And surely he did. In my case, it turned out that Melanie's brain damage was very gross damage to the cerebellum and the brain stem. Later we were able to discover that her cortex was pretty well intact, which made her able to learn really an awful lot, much more than people thought she would have been able to in her early days. But the brain stem had knocked out her feeding system. So the biggest challenges of her early life, in fact, the biggest challenges of her whole life, it turned out, was a very, very compromised feeding system. One of the things that I found most difficult to understand and to hear my pediatrician say was that she couldn't swallow. I mean, how can you not swallow? He would say it, and because she would choke on the milk. Every time the milk got into her throat, and then she got to a phase where she made huge progress. She learned to vomit rather than to choke. What painful progress. But it was progress. But it was incomprehensible to me that he could be looking me in my face and saying she can't swallow. I'm thinking, what are you talking about? Everybody can swallow. Swallowing's automatic. Swallowing's a given. I didn't know enough about brain structure or function to have any idea that this could possibly have happened. So I kept asking him over and over. We got to a point, you'll know this too, we got to a point where he would begin almost every answer with, as I told you before, Mrs. Stilaxa. But I was fortunate to meet some wonderful bearers of the bad news who were able to make the news better and better. But first, let me just say a little about Melanie, the asymmetric tonic reflex that those of you familiar with kids with cerebral palsy have seen. And actually, you know, it's a reflex that's typical of all newborns. And they lie like this, but they're floppy, and they can move, and it's easy. Well, for her, it was like this. And like this. And when it was like this, her head would be to the other side, and her eyes would be over in the corner. I'm going to talk to you about her eyes in a minute. So this is a little baby who was so challenging. You can see it only took a quick look at her to know that she was damaged and that she was going to have a real hard time, and we were going to have a real hard time understanding her. But this little quote from Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice haunted me for the whole first 6, 7, 8, 9 months of her life. Sometimes from her eyes I have received fair, speechless messages. Melanie spoke to me at all times with her eyes. Her face did not have much expression, and later on we discovered that it was because of the brainstem damage that had damaged all the autonomic reflexes, had also damaged her ability to express her feelings with her face. But her eyes were always talking to me, and I knew that within the first few months of her life. There were some doctors and some people who looked at her who wondered if she had vision at all, and I knew that she had vision from the very beginning. I was very fortunate. I was able to go to Toronto. I had lived in Canada for many years. I'm Jamaican, figure that out, right? I had lived in Canada, but my husband was Trinidadian, so we were living in Trinidad. But we had lived in Canada, and we had lots of contacts there. My brothers lived there, and we had lots of family members there. And so we were able to go there for our more extensive and more, hopefully, expert in interpretations of Melanie. And truly, the most wonderful people that met Melanie throughout her life were women. I have nothing against you wonderful men. We can't live without you. And I'm sure there are wonderful male doctors out there, but in my experience, it was the women who were able to approach the baby, approach Melanie with an open mind. They were able to look at what she did rather than what she didn't do. And I mentioned here Dr. Karen Pape. I am going to take a moment to show you this. Let me just tell you the story first, though. I met Dr. Pape in Toronto. She was a neonatologist. She was young. She was barely maybe 34 years old. And the first day I went, I took Melanie to her. She put Melanie on a table. And she had a little toy, a little spiky porcupine that squeaked. It was a very ugly little toy, I thought. And she kept showing it to Melanie, and she showed it to Melanie, and it seemed to me as she moved the little toy around, Melanie kept turning away from it, like this. Now, I thought, why is she, I was getting pretty irritated because she did this for about 15 minutes. And I'm sitting on the edge of my seat, you know, lion mother, thinking, why are you provoking my child? I mean, give her a break. After about 15 minutes, Dr. Pape turned to me and she said, do you see what she's doing? And I said, no, I don't think she likes that toy at all. And she said, well, let's look again. Well, Melanie had a habit of having her eyes in the corner like this and of turning away from everything. Well, it turned out that Dr. Pape demonstrated to me that if she put the toy in the midline at the center of Melanie's face, Melanie would look at it absolutely. When she moved it, Melanie could not do this to look at it, nor could she just move her eyes to look at it. So what was she doing? She moved in the opposite direction. So here's the toy. She goes, it's like this. She goes, take my glasses off. You move it over here, she goes. Very, very abnormal pattern. But what she was doing was compensating for her own ability to track. So she turned her head the opposite way. Well, you can imagine my excitement when Dr. Pape demonstrated this to me, because really through all those 6 months of Melanie's beginning and early life, I had noticed this pattern, and I had always thought she was turning away from whatever the stimulus was, and often the stimulus was me. So you can imagine I used to have to sit her on my lap. After she got past the tube feeding, we fed her with a spoon. She couldn't suck. She couldn't even open her mouth. Her jaws were like a trap. So I would ease the milk into her mouth with a spoon, and she would sit on my lap facing me. And then every now and then, you know, she'd be turning away and turning, and I thought, she doesn't like the milk. Gee, maybe she doesn't like me. You know, it was really confusing. What a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful revelation that woman gave to me. Yes, I knew my daughter better than she did in many ways. But would I ever have known that? How long would it have taken me to figure that out? So I want to say here, a real heads up to all the wonderful professionals who really can help us, and wish that we can meet more and more and more of them. Dr. Pape right now is working in Toronto, and she's working on a thesis that she calls
rehab bit.
Habit Hides Recovery.
You know, I've been doing this
I want to show you
rehab
just a little
bit
bit
for a long time, over 35 years.
Is she coming out?
And it's one of my basic humiliations that it's taken me about 32 years to figure this one out. When I look back, things are always obvious after you figure them out. Yeah. And when I look back, I can see components of this particular concept in my writings as far back as 1970s. And what I'm going to show you is habit hides recovery. She's going to lift her arm, and it's pretty abnormal. You all happy that's abnormal? She can't lift her arm overhead? What happened to her overhead lift? Okay? So this is a habit. This is the way she learned to move when she first started to have neural recovery. So the question when you see a child doing this, is it habit or is it recovery or is it neurologic damage? Since we know that human brains can grow new cells, new connections, and new systems, and we know the neuroscience term for that is neuroplasticity, the basis of the course, this course, is that in mild and moderate injury, there is sufficient recovery to make normal function possible.
I would encourage anyone who's interested in that theory to look at it. And what really, at the time, Dr. Pape was working with some therapists who engaged in what was called neurodevelopmental therapy. It's also referred to as Bobath therapy, developed by a woman named Vera Bobath in Britain. I believe there are other versions of it that may have other names at this time, but it's basically assuming just what Dr. Pape was saying, that in the early years with brain damage, the child learns to move in ways that look very abnormal. That becomes a habit. Later on, though, although the brain is repairing itself, the functions that the child learns to do as the brain is repairing itself actually look better. They can do better movements than they could do of the early movements. So as you saw that there, and she has, if she has demonstrations too of, for instance, a child walking with a very abnormal gait and then running with a perfectly normal gait. So the habit hangs on and hides or disguises the recovery. Well, Melanie was very fortunate to have a wonderful therapist, well, several wonderful therapists, starting in Toronto, and then when we went back to Trinidad. And you can see her here. As I show the next couple of slides, I want you to watch her hands. And you'll see she still has the ATNR posture, right? And the right hand is almost always fisted. And the left hand more likely to be open. And that was something we watched, and we could see her as she learned to start opening that hand. And as she learned all the wonderful movements that were being taught to her. And as she learned, too, to name the world. When I started teaching her, I mean, I used to talk to her, you know, you talk to your baby, you blah, 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 blah. But it didn't occur to me until I started reading an article one day that I really needed to be talking in a very instructive way. And what the article said to me was that parents of normally developing children blab away at their babies until the baby starts giving a cue that they're understanding. And when the baby starts giving those cues, the parent instinctively starts simplifying their language and talking in a more instructional way. Well, with a baby like Melanie, she's not giving the cues. It's not clear to me that she's understanding, so I'm still talking. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start teaching her. And I spent months just walking around the house teaching, naming every single thing. In this picture, of course, we're naming the features of the face. The most exciting day, I think, of my life with Melanie was the day I discovered that she was understanding language. That day, I put her on her changing table, and she was, oh my gosh, maybe a year and a half or so, I think. And put her on the changing table, and there was a little shelf where I kept her hairbrush. And as I put her down, she turned and tried to swipe the hairbrush. And I thought, oh, isn't that nice? She knows the brush is there. She knows the routine. And then I thought, I wonder if she knows the word, because I've been teaching it. But I never thought of testing her. So I turned her back the other way, and I said, where's the brush, Melanie? She turned around and swiped the brush. And I said, where's whatever the next thing was on the table? And she turned around, and I said, where's the window, Melanie? And she turned towards the window, and of course her turning was, you know, very tentative but very clear. Where's the door, Melanie? Where's the picture of Daddy on the wall, Melanie? Turned out Melanie had been learning the names of everything that I had been teaching her. It was so, so exciting because, of course, it meant to me that she would be able to make sense of the world and that I would be able to get a clear-cut communication system with her, whether or not she could talk. And she never did learn to talk. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about therapy. Now, when I discovered what was happening with Melanie, and after we were able to go to Canada and get some interpretations and some more positive ones, my next thought was, well, who's going to teach Melanie? It turned out it had to be me. I was living in Trinidad. How many of you are from developing countries or have had some experience in developing countries? And you will know, thank you, that there we don't have the funds to do the wonderful things that we can do here in the U.S. We don't have laws that require that services must be given to kids who don't fit the norm. So parents, church groups, advocates have to do it themselves, much like how it started here 50, 60 years ago. That's how we began too, right? That's how the Ark came into being, exactly. So, but we're about 60 years behind the U.S. So I knew I would have to do something, and I started a little school for Melanie. I was very blessed in being able to come in contact with two therapists, a speech therapist and a physical therapist, who turned out to be a neurodevelopmental therapist. She had been trained by Vera Bobath in England and was living in Trinidad. And she and the speech therapist were running, had a little clinic, but they wanted a teacher because the kids had nowhere to go. So they said to me, would you like to join us? And I said, yeah, I'd like to join you. So I joined them, and we opened a school that we called the Immortel Center. And I'm going to tell you just a moment about the Immortel. The Immortel, this tree is called, in Trinidad, it's called the Immortel. In Jamaica and many other places, in South Florida, for instance, we have it too, and it's called Ponciana. How many of you have seen it? If you've been in tropical countries, you know this tree. There are many different colors of it. And it grows tall and wild in the forests. And in Trinidad, the Immortel has a particular importance. Historically, the staple crop of Trinidad was the cocoa plant that makes cocoa and chocolate. The cocoa plant is a very delicate plant. It's very sensitive to sunlight. It doesn't grow well in direct sunlight. So the farmers would plant their cocoa in the shade of the Immortel. And we thought that the children that we were serving, with their fragility and their special needs, needed just enough shade to protect them while they grew and learned. So this is the Immortel Center, and the next set of slides show you the therapy, and you saw these in the introduction. Now, this hand here on Melanie's shoulder is the hand of the therapist, the physical therapist. And you can see what she's doing is just putting pressure on the shoulder to teach Melanie where the shoulder should be as she tries to get up on her all fours. You see the little fist, still the right hand still fisted, the left hand nicely open. The best thing about Melanie was that she was so motivated by physical therapy that she would practice on her own. So here's a picture of Melanie trying to get up on her knees all by herself, and she would spend her mornings doing that. We had a wonderful opportunity where she had therapy every day. And this we were able to do for 6 months until something's changed and I had to go away, and there's more to that story. But I do want to make a comment about this. Here she is sitting up. Can you see her hands? Wide open. And isn't that sitting beautiful? Now, as a professional in special education now in the U.S., I find myself thinking about the therapy Melanie had a great deal. I look at early childhood programs, and I look at our current philosophy of natural environments and providing services in the natural environment, in the home and daycare centers. I think it's a wonderful principle in the sense that therapists can work with kids in a real environment where they can carry over. There should be more carryover, there should be more transfer than when you pull a kid out and train and teach the kid in a decontextualized kind of setting. However, I worry about the dilution of intensive therapies that some children need. If Melanie had not had the kind of intensive physiotherapy she got, I don't know how she would have developed. And I doubt very much that she would have been able to develop the very normal sort of postures. If she'd been left to her own devices to figure out how to sit up, I think her sitting up would have looked very different from this. So I have a little kind of a bandwagon about this, that as we do the natural environments and as we do inclusion, we really need to keep on believing and understanding that therapy is therapy. And if you get a skilled therapist, whether it's speech, language, OT, this is a person whose work is going to be very, very important to the child. And you can see how lovely she was by the time she learned to stand. Now, she couldn't get up there by herself. She could get on her knees in front of the sofa, and then she'd try to get up, but she couldn't do that push. So we'd help her up, and she could stand. She wanted to get onto the sofa, but she couldn't do that either. So we'd put her on, and then she learned to get off. So she'd turn around, and I'll tell you about that, a story about that in a minute. And this is my favorite picture of her. Of course, she couldn't get onto the bike, the trike. She couldn't ride it either. But you put her on, and she'd hold on for dear life. And look at the smile. I think she was the proudest of herself when she sat on that tricycle. Finally, I'm going to talk a bit about family, without which all the other stuff I've said doesn't go anywhere. Or it can go someplace, but our babies need us. And when we look back at the very sad history, not of only of the U.S., but everywhere, where so many children with special needs were abandoned and removed from families, and the belief was that, they would break up the family and all kinds of stuff. It's hard to think back to those days. In our family, we knew that we needed some balance. And by Melanie's the time Melanie was a year and a half, she had started to recover after many complicated efforts from her feeding difficulties, and that had settled down. And I became pregnant with my second child. And I'm going to read to you the introduction to my son, Mark. On October 18 of that year, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I made my first entry in a little diary that I call the Book of Joy. The entry reads, "The Book of Joy begins with tears, wild, trembling, overpowering tears of joy that wash away the fear, the pain. Now it is safe to cry. Now weep the flood of fear that filled the bed, that soaked the banks. Now let it flow. Now wash, now cleanse, now heal, now free." Mark had arrived, the world's oldest miracle reenacted for me. And as he left me, forcing his way into the world, I heard a voice like mine, crying out as from a distance, "Is he all right? Is he all right? Is he all right?" Then uncontrollable tears, then laughter, then both becoming one, as my son, screaming his newborn power, gave me his answer. As the days passed, I gradually returned from my trembling euphoria. Mark introduced himself to me in no uncertain terms. I could hardly believe that this was supposed to be the same experience I had known 2 years before in bearing my first child. This child's power overwhelmed me, and to me he seemed no helpless human infant, but rather a magnificent bundle of infinitely powerful instincts and reflexes, capable of commanding and making use of every ounce of available attention and sustenance. In Melanie, I had seen true helplessness, a frail, beautiful little creature, a bird with a broken wing. And now I was awed by the power of this new creature we had made, an organism perfectly equipped for coping with life and motivated only by his own need for survival. I called him the critter. To me, he seemed such an ordinary little critter that in the first weeks I often feared that I would be unable to love him. How could one genuinely love a creature to whom one had to be so totally subservient? There was no doubt that he was the master, and I had neither the philosophy nor the energy to enter into a battle of wills with him. For 3 months, he was a colicky, screaming infant with a voice of thunder, and my condition moved rapidly from euphoria to exhaustion. There were days when every scream seemed an accusation against which I might have to defend myself. And of course, one invariably resents one's accuser. Ah, my little critter, in those early weeks, how I loved and feared you. that chapter ends with just saying that as he gained in independence and mobility and could express his characteristic driving energy through movement and interaction with his environment, Mark became no longer the critter, but a true creature of delight. Melanie had the hardest time with him for the first couple of months because I was breastfeeding him, and she was being fed with a bottle. So I would sit on the couch, he's at my left breast, I'd have a little pushchair on the right with her bottle stuck into her mouth. By then she could drink from the bottle. So it was, here I was on the left, here I was on the right. Because if I didn't feed her when I fed him, she raised a ruckus. She was so jealous. So I was really in a bit of a strange spot at that time. Just a couple more pictures, and I'm going to move towards the end here. Mark's second birthday, you can see that by this time, he was a little bit bigger than her. He was 2 and she was 4. I used to carry them in a pushchair, in a twin stroller. And people would say, oh, they're twins. He must be the first one. You know, sometimes the first twin's bigger than the others. So it was quite something. This is her birthday picture with her cousins in Toronto, and she's holding, oh, the little boy, Simon, next to her is holding Kermit the Frog. She was a Kermit the Frog fanatic. By then, she would sit and watch Sesame Street, and it was at the time, anybody remember Mr. Rogers? It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Oh boy, she was in love with Mr. Rogers. I said she had a crush on him. And this picture with her dad, my husband, Clive, who was recently, a couple of years ago, passed away, and myself and Mark in Jamaica at my brother's home. Now, I want to just tell you a couple little anecdotes very quickly, just to tell you how lovely Melanie was in her last year and 2 of life, how much her comprehension had come, you know, to fruition. One of the things that I taught her quite early on was to say yes. So I would hold her head and force it down like this. And gradually, eventually, she would give a lovely yes, all the way down, chin on her chest. Right? She loved to do that. But that wasn't as great as when she learned to say no. I started working on the no. I would hold her head, and if I knew for sure she didn't want something, I'd move it, you know, from side to side like this. This was very hard for her because you can imagine that the coordination was very difficult. Now, in that little house that we lived in Trinidad at that time, there was no bathtub. There was a shower. So I used to walk into the shower with her to have her shower. She did not like it one bit. She hated the water coming over her face. So she always protested. But one day I step into the shower with Melanie, and she's twisting and turning, and it seems to me she's trying to get out of my arms. I'm saying, what are you doing? What are you doing, Melanie? And all of a sudden, I looked at her, and I realized that she was turning from the left and turning to the right, and it was all very deliberate. And I said to her, Melanie, are you saying no? And she went, and after that, you know, she gave up on her picture board. At that point, she used to have a picture board which she would point to. We'd say, what do you want? And she'd point to the swings or the music or her food or whatever. She didn't want that anymore because she wanted us to ask her 20 questions. So do you want your food? So she would have to say as many no's as she possibly could until we got a yes. She was quite a character. And the last story I'll tell you about her was we had an experience which I don't have time to detail now, but it was an experience where a psychologist in Toronto had done a wonderful assessment of her. She did the assessment using a procedure called, or an approach called dynamic assessment. It was developed by a man named Reuven Feuerstein. And the basis of it is that if you're going to assess a child, you must teach the child something and then assess their learning of it. You can't just assess them assuming they've been taught what you're testing. So, long story short, we had gone to this lady's home, and she had, with much struggle with Melanie, got Melanie to learn to go down the stairs. She couldn't do it alone, but to turn on her tummy and stretch her legs out, and the therapist would help her down and then helped her back up. So she couldn't do this independently, but she had learned the process. So we go back home to Trinidad, and one day, Melanie used to love Mr. Rogers, as I mentioned. So she would sit and watch Mr. Rogers for half an hour, and I could put her around, do whatever I wanted. So one day she was sitting watching Mr. Rogers in the little living room, and I was in my room reading a book, enjoying myself. Now, it was a very safe little cul-de-sac that we lived on, and I used to keep the house open. The front door was wide open. So I'm lying in my bed, reading my book, thinking my child is totally wrapped up in her idol, Mr. Rogers. And I hear a voice calling from outside, "Miss, Miss." So I get up and I look through the window, and there's a little boy, and he says, "Miss, Miss, the baby, the baby." And sure enough, there was Melanie sitting out in the yard. She had turned around, gone right through the door, slid down the steps, and was sitting about 6 feet away from the gate. The gate, fortunately, was locked. Can you imagine my horror and also my delight to know that my little girl had tried to run away from home? Well, thank you very much. You've been a most wonderful audience, and I'm going to just end on a little bit of I guess it's a sad note, but I hope it's a hopeful note. As you know, Melanie passed away when she was 5. It was very unfortunate, very unexpected. I'll just tell you, because you may not read the book. She died by choking, which, of course, any of us could die by choking, but I think her muscles were so spastic in that feeding process that no matter how they worked on that Heimlich procedure, they could not release the trap that her throat had become. So it was very sudden and shocking and painful. And so I want to just read to you a little passage that tells you what my perspective on that was and what it still is. So the title of the last chapter is "She Looks All Right." Looking back, I see that every moment of anxiety, of distress, of love, of joy, every failure and every success with Melanie had deepened my perception of the mystery that is life and prepared me for her death in a way that I knew on the spot what my perspective must be. As I called across the room, there was someone else in the room, the words flowed easily as if they had been forever on the tip of my tongue. I spoke about how much we had loved Melanie and how much that love had been returned. Melanie died in the arms and in the care of someone she loved and trusted. She knew that she was not alone and that everything was being done to help her. We had never deserted her. She had known that all her life. We had loved her unreservedly and had shown our love every day of her life. Some weeks after her birth, my mother had asked a doctor in Jamaica to phone the pediatrician for his opinion on Melanie's condition. Dr. McDowell had said, and I wasn't told this till years later, that he had estimated that there was perhaps a 1% chance that she would have survived infancy. 1%. And here she was 5 years later. So she could have died then, before we had a chance to know her, to love her. She could have come and gone like a ship in the night, and we would have lost her and not known what we had lost. But this way we have gained. We have accomplished something, and she has gained. She gained a chance at life, and she gave it her very best. She had a life full of the kind of love that some people never know in a long lifetime. We have nothing to regret, no fault to find, no guilt to bear, only the pain of losing her, and we will have to live through that. My husband came and saw me holding her. Clive arrived, and I had to repeat 3 times that she was dead before he heard what I had said. He looked at her lying still in my arms, and he said, "But she looks like she's sleeping. She looks all right." Thank you.